Good morning, and welcome to the sort of nerve center of Synaxis Press again, the typesetting composition room, and actually the printing presses in one part of the room. I wanted to address a couple of issues that I'd seen in the newspaper this morning, but I've seen them a couple of times. And I wondered sometimes if people really do have a real sense of the sort of thing that goes on in the world, or if we've sometimes perhaps a bit too narrow in a kind of moralism that doesn't take into account the much bigger picture and some of the questions. I don't know how many of you follow international news, but it turns out that for some times now, people in East Asia, and it seems particularly in South Korea, but of course in China as well, have been taking supplements, one of these kind of bottled supplements you get at the pharmacy or health food store, which consist of dehydrated, I could almost say brace yourselves, dehydrated baby's flesh. No, I'm not making it up, it's true. That's actually what's been happening. Aborted fetuses, miscarriages, sometimes children who died just a natural death. There is a supplement that's been being sold in capsule form made of dehydrated baby's flesh that people are taking for the worst possible reasons. And without it ever occurring to them that it's, first of all, genuine cannibalism, and secondly, the enormity of the fact that this is made most of it probably from aborted fetuses. So when people talk about right to life, right to choice, I don't believe that there is such a thing as a right to life movement, because the people who call themselves right to life also advocate death penalties and seem to have not too much interest in children who are already born and their lives and welfare. But in any case, let's take a look at the idea of how easy it is to have abortions. It's when you reduce your regard for human life and quibble about exactly when life begins and all that. The problem doesn't stop there, it goes beyond that. The fact that people can actually dehydrate the flesh of dead babies and put it in a capsule and sell it as a supplement, a food supplement, or in this case, something to make your life longer and increase your virility, which is what it's being advertised for. That has to be among the most shocking and horrifying things that have come up in the news in quite a while. And I wanted to invite attention to it for people who might not have followed it or seen it in the news. And you can probably Google this and follow the news reports about it. Among the other things that take place in our world in technology, transferring genes from one animal to another, okay, you can find a justification for it somehow if you want to, and perhaps there is some. But, and here's another one you can follow up because it's been done at the University of Utah at their agricultural center, where they've taken now, when we talk about genes, there's often a great misunderstanding about what we're talking about. People are so used to saying, oh, there's no gene for no gay gene and things like that, because they're ignorant of how genes work or what genes are all about. When you hear the word gene, the first thing to think about is protein, the creation of a protein. Now, the gene from the spider, which allows for the spinning of this super strong anchor thread, stronger than the rest of the web, is the anchor thread that the spider weaves to hold itself in place, even against strong wind or when it leaps and comes back and things like that. The gene that allows for the creation of that protein, which is what genes do, has been implanted in goats. Now what happens is that this protein now will come out in the goat's milk. and can be isolated from the goat's milk, spun, and put on a spool. So just think about it for a moment, that the spider gene is transplanted into the zygote of the goat, and then it produces this silk that the spider produces. Oh, I'm sure there are uses for it. You could use it medically, for sure. You could use it militarily, of course. Most of the big technological discoveries are things that have a military application. The artificial life form called Cynthia, where with computer now, you can create a genome, download it into a life form, create a completely new artificial life form, then you reboot the organism, and you have an artificial life form. I don't know how many of you maybe read science fiction, or how many are familiar with the science fiction novel, the Andromeda Strain. No, we don't need to bring something from outer space or anything, or find it, beneath the earth. We're creating these artificial life forms. And we engineer bacteria so that it will perform a certain task for us. But it's interesting that a bacterium can become resistant to antibiotics because they evolve very fast. A simple organism makes rapid evolution. The more complex an organism becomes, the more it relies on microevolution in small increments, because it's a very complex life form with a lot of interdependent entities within it. But bacteria can do this very quickly. And suppose we create a strain of bacteria that is going to clean up an oil spill by eating oil. What happens when it runs out of food? Does it always die off? Or kind of perhaps adapt to eating something else that we don't want it to eat in order to survive? It's a good question. It's an interesting question. And we're not going to know that for quite a while. But when we do find it out, we might be rather horrified at what we've done. I'm not making a prophecy. I'm just offering one of the possibilities in the sort of thing that takes place. Now, people ask, okay, what is scientism? Fundamentalists are always throwing this word around when science happens to come up with something that they don't like, or that disproves one of their models of reality, and they don't want to accept reality and truth. However, scientism is also a kind of thing where people are getting carried away with the technologies of science and doing things that, in all likelihood, should never be done. And we have no idea what sort of things might be created by using this. Let's take an example now of how difficult it is. There's a whole new generation of what they call underwear explosives for suicide bombers who might want to fly on an airplane and blow it up. And it's been developed because Al-Qaeda, particularly in Yemen, has technologists and scientists now working at developing very difficult to impossible to detect sort of explosives or bombs that can be concealed in specially fitted underwear, particularly underwear, and almost impossible to detect them even with a pat down, And of course, a lot of inspectors there's certain areas of the body where they're a little reticent to pat anyway. But this is science and technology being used in a certain way, and a very dangerous and deadly way. But creating a strain of bacteria that's artificial and not in any way natural, ultimately, has with it a lot of dangers. And of course, losing control is the main one. We're not at the top of the food chain. We're not the most resilient of organisms. Bacteria and viri, or I think now we say viruses more often, are really at the top of the food chain. And we're sometimes, a very slowly devoured lunch. So we have to have a little more respect for some of these things and the things that are being done with them. To me, this more properly defines scientism. When you do things just because you can and don't really take into account the possible ramifications or the possible end results of what one's doing. But the challenge is we can do it, therefore we will do it, and perhaps we shouldn't be doing it because it could pose an enormous danger, and we could suddenly expose a huge portion of the population to something rather catastrophic. So that's just one thing I wanted to bring up to discuss. And the other thing that I want to talk about is one of the dangers of people avoiding reality. And people in the church who have faith, well, some degree of faith anyway. And I want to turn back to this thing, and especially because this John Whitford, who's a horrid little man, Father John Whitford, is on some kind of raving rampage. And I'm going to respond not just to him, but to everyone who's kind of fundamentalist bent, who is unable to cope with truth and reality, and who can live only by very, very narrow, sometimes rather egotistic ideologies that can't expand out to what is actually going on, what the actual realities of the world are. One of the dangers of that, of course, is not being up on what's taking place in science and technology that can be quite destructive like this. What, by using a red herring or a false definition of scientism, misses what the real problem is and the real issue is, the real scientism. And I'm going to just cut right to the chase. You can roll around on the floor, scream, gnash your teeth, rend your garments, or threaten to eat dirt or whatever, or hold your breath. But the Earth is still going to be 4.5 billion years old, and you're not going to change it. Evolution is still going to be a fact. One of the most well-proved and well-demonstrated theories of science. You're not going to change that. You can't change it. That's the reality. That's the truth. Mankind has been on this earth more than 100,000 years, and has evolved. On one branch, it came out, and we're one of the products of that evolution. I mean, we believe and we confess that this is the unfolding of God's eternal will. But denying it isn't going to make it go away. It isn't going to change it. All it's going to do is make it impossible for some people to develop faith and become real Christians. And what I want to submit is that if your faith is based on models of reality, even ones that have been based in Scripture, based in the Holy Fathers, still a model of reality that you have. If that's what your faith is based on, so that you're afraid your faith will collapse if you face truth and reality, you don't have faith. You don't have faith at all. You just have a kind of egotistic idée fixe, somehow that your mind is frozen into something and you can't cope with anything else. It's not faith. You know, faith is the evidence of things not seen. And when we come to see some of those things, faith should be unshaken and still intact. There's no reason. I mean, faith is not coming into accord with a system of facts. Faith is an orientation of the heart toward the will of God, an orientation of the soul, not a collection of a system of facts that one has to accept, even if they're false, in order to consider oneself a true believer or to actually have faith. If your faith cannot survive in the face of truth and reality, you don't have faith. You only have some kind of self-focus and some kind of egotistic collection of models that you want to somehow defend. And the other issue, of course, seems to cause a great deal of hysteria and show some of the most savage, nasty, mean-minded, hate-filled and malicious reactions that I've ever seen is a case of people who are transgendered or intersex. This is an absolutely valid clinical condition. The person's true gender is their brain. The body happens to be a different gender than the brain. It's not even complicated to see how that happens. It's no great mystery. It's not some metaphysical abstraction. It's a valid medical clinical condition. And people who are cursing and condemning these people, or suggesting that they should not have the sexual harmonization surgery, or accusing them of not accepting the gender that God gave them when it's precisely the opposite. They are accepting the gender that God gave them, because the gender, all self-awareness, all personal awareness, all gender sexual awareness, all awareness of reality, of existence, of being, of personhood, it's in the brain. It's not in the genitalia. It's not in the body. It's in the brain. The gender that God gave you is the gender your brain is. Not always the gender your body is, because your body can be a totally different gender than your brain. Has no great mystery how it happens. You know, we have try to sort out the mechanisms. Perhaps someday it can be prevented. But at this point, you know, we know how, but we don't know the details of the mechanisms. Very often, something that happens like this, well, you know, I usually use this, the reference to cystic fibrosis, because, first of all, because we're beginning to get a handle on cystic fibrosis and moving closer and closer to developing a way to deal with it. It's a genetic illness. There is no gene that sits there and says, I'm going to give you cystic fibrosis, I'm going to strangle you to death with mucus. There is a gene that is supposed to produce a simple protein. That protein is necessary for building an intracellular pump to regulate the salinity of the contents of the cells. Now, that gene, the only thing that gene does is not to do what it's supposed to do. It doesn't produce the protein. In the absence of the protein, no intracellular pump to regulate the salinity of the cells, your body's overpowered with mucus, and your lungs are so weakened with it that you get all kinds of lung infections and diseases and pneumonias and things like that, and eventually die from it, sometimes suffocating on your own mucus. It's just like the old story. For want of a nail, you couldn't put a horseshoe on the horse, therefore one horse was taken out of battle, because for want of the horse, you were want of short a soldier. For want of that soldier, you lose the battle. But it's all about a nail for the horseshoe. It's not about the horse or the warrior. And it's just what happens when a protein is not produced. So sometimes when there's a trisomy, chromosome doesn't divide properly, that sort of thing. But you know, this incredible, unspeakable cruelty and barbarous brutality about the subject of transgendered people, and the desire to force them to continue to live in hell already in this life. It's one of the most despicable things that I've come across ever, and especially when it's done in the name of Christ. People seem to think that some of these things are magical. I mean, it's absolutely insane to think that somebody would choose to have a brain that's a different gender than their body, or that the body is the gender rather than the brain, as if the body somehow had its own mentality all by itself, that it didn't need the brain, that it could operate independently of the brain. So let's just look at it for a moment. Oh, in some place like Texas especially, where the national sport is executing people whether they're innocent or guilty. And you get, particularly in the American South, where generally the mentality there is medieval. I mean, people in Middle America and the American South, their minds are still in the Middle Ages. And it's far more to do with superstition than it is with faith. Even a lot of the religion there is absolute abject superstition. Remember, that's the place where you have to prove your faith by kissing a rattlesnake on the head. This is a part of the problem. The world cannot stand still and wait for you to catch up, to come from the 12th to the 21st century. The world has to go on. It has to continue living. It has to move forward. People have to continue to live in this world and in this century and deal with the realities of life. They can't hide behind these cruel, vicious, and savage superstitions that you try to force on them. And so I'm going to say once more, evolution is a fact. You can deny it, but not successfully. Together with quantum mechanics, it's one of the most absolutely well-proved theories of science, demonstrated by so many different avenues, and of course by genetics. Everyone who's watching this video, unless you live in Africa or come from African stock, which has never interbred with any white person, which precludes most slave women from the 1800s, every one of you carry the genes of two very distinct species of human. Two very distinct species of human. Not one, but at least two, and perhaps some three. Very distinct species of humanity. Now, again, you can howl and whine and shriek and deny it, but it doesn't do any good because it doesn't change the truth and it doesn't change the reality. That is the reality. And evolution took place, one species to another. That's not even that great a mystery. I mean, to find a finely detailed process, but nevertheless, it certainly has happened. Sexual reproduction began, at most, or at least I should say 3 billion years ago. And sexual reproduction is the way all mammals function. Almost everything that exists on the face of the earth, including apples, pears, and peaches. That's why we need bees to cross-pollinate, these trees. With kiwi fruit, for example, you have to have a male and a female in order to produce the fruit, because they reproduce sexually, even plants. So the superstitions and mythologies about it that are being people are trying to foist on people, are ultimately doing far more harm, undermining the faith far more completely and absolutely than truth and reality are. And the reason why people are insisting on these things and trying to foist them on people is because they don't have real faith. Their faith is not real, it's not solid, it's not firm. Being a fundamentalist and hysterically proclaiming that, say, the scripture has to be taken absolutely literally, that the earth is 10,000 years old and every word, every detail, everything in the scripture is absolutely infallible. In a way, that's a form of atheism. In the first place, it isn't true. It simply is not the truth. Scripture is about meaning. It's not about these things. Moses had to come down from the Mount of Sinai with the Ten Commandments. It would have been useless for him to come down with the periodic table of the elements. The creation narrative is not about the creation of the universe. The only thing it tells us about the creation is that God did it. But we know that. I mean, that's perfectly reasonable and understandable. It doesn't tell us how or any of the processes at all. It simply tells us how man got into the condition he's in, the fact he needs a redeemer, he needs somebody to save him and deliver him out of that. But if you try to take it literally, it isn't true. You can't take it literally. There are two different distinct stories about the creation of man, of humanity. One involves a rib, the other doesn't. In the beginning, he created male and female created he them. In one story, he creates the animals before mankind, and another, he creates the animals after mankind. It has to be one or the other, can't be both. You know, the door is either open or it's closed. So that's these are things I simply want to respond to some of this very destructive and in some cases unspeakably cruel and malicious things that are being said by fundamentalists within the Orthodox Church. Now, we're going to continue reading from the demonstrations that the Toll House myth is absolutely false, has no foundation whatsoever in patristics, absolutely no foundation in Scripture. No matter how much the people use the Scripture, and mark you, they know that they're twisting and distorting the Scripture. They're going to insist the Scripture is absolutely infallible. Doesn't mention the toll houses once. And they will reinterpret Scripture and even rewrite it in some cases and say something absolutely contrary to what the Holy Father said about that Scripture in order to try to prove this fetish, because the toll house myth has become a fetish for the toll house cult. It's soul-destroying, it's destructive, it denies our redemption, it denies the power of Jesus Christ, it denies the power and victory of the cross. And yet they insist on spreading it because they belong to a cult, the toll house cult, and they have a fetish about the toll houses. And they're willing to lie about what Scripture says, not make a mistake, but willingly and premeditatedly lie about what the Scripture says, and lie about what Holy Father said, twist, change, torment, leave out parts of statements to try to make it prove something that it absolutely does not prove. Those people who continue to advocate the toll house myth pretend to offer Scripture and things from the actual Holy Fathers to justify the toll house myth. Brothers and sisters, they're liars. Pure and simple. Not people making a mistake, not people making an error. They're liars. So what else are they lying about? Who knows? Anyway, thank you, and God bless you.